As in Moscow, Khrushchev was boarding the plane that was to take him to the USA. Last-minute preparations were taking place at the White House. Every little detail of Kay's day-to-day itinerary was meticulously thought through. Overall, the American plan was pretty straightforward. First, a 10-day long road trip across the country, showcasing the best America had to offer. The idea behind this was very simple. America's greatness, wealth and strength were supposed to stun and overwhelm the Soviet leader. Thus, by the end of the trip, during talks with President Eisenhower at Camp David, an overly impressed Khrushchev was supposed to be much easier to negotiate with, and at least some of the major Cold War issues would finally be solved in favor of the United States. Khrushchev's agenda for the upcoming trip, on the other hand, was an exact opposite of the American one. He was not to be amazed at any cost, not to look weak under any circumstances, and also to make a good impression, to show the human face of communism, so to say. Here is how he would remember his feelings during the flight in his audio memoirs.
Our relations with the United States at the time were cold and tense. So the upcoming 2 weeks did feel like an important test for me. Because in politics, especially in diplomacy, proper balance is everything. If you talk too softly, your enemy will stop respecting you. If you talk too loudly, on the other hand, you can end up shitting your own pants. And this was not just any country. This was America, our most powerful adversary.
Khrushchev wanted to use every step of the trip to his advantage. A good example would be the fact that on his orders, the Soviet delegation was traveling on a huge ultra-modern plane, the Tu-114, the only passenger jet in the world capable of flying non-stop from Moscow to Washington. The Russians had only one operational Tu-114, and it was Khrushchev's pride and joy. But just before the flight, cracks were discovered in its engines, and it was deemed unsafe to fly. Khrushchev's advisors begged him to take a different plane and fly with a stopover, but Khrushchev ignored their pleas. He wanted to impress the Americans at any cost, even if that involved risking his life and the lives of everyone on board. But luckily for everyone, the plane made it to America in one piece. And by the time it started its descent over Washington, all 4 major participants of the upcoming grandiose Cold War roadshow were ready. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, American President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American people, and the free-spirited American media, which will play an unexpected role over the course of the next 2 weeks.
Our entire 2-hour program this morning is given over to a man whose name I'll bet you can't spell. Can you? We made a little survey and found that not 1 out of 20 people can spell Khrushchev's name. Try it right now. How do you spell it? Well, it's K-H-R-U-S-H-C-H-E-V. In profile, Nikita Khrushchev, a profile we're looking at more closely than ever before, trying to see what it tells us about this man who is now at the height of his power. A short, relatively fat man who hardly fits our image of what the most powerful dictator in the world should be. How did this bulky fellow with the rotund face that might be that of a clown reach his present pinnacle? This morning we have as our guest Mr. Nicholas Kovac, who's been supporting himself in this country for many years by playing and making some of Khrushchev's favorite instruments, the domra.
As the American media poked fun at Khrushchev's expense, trying to paint him less scary than usual, in order to bring the fear factor down a notch for the American public, the Soviet leader stepped onto American soil for the first time.
We were very worried about what kind of reception we would get in America. What if the Americans discriminated against us in some way? What if they omitted, on purpose of course, some little ceremony or ritual that is supposed to be performed for the head of a foreign country? We knew that they didn't consider us human beings. In their eyes, we were representatives of a country not worthy of any honors, a country you could piss on.
During the months leading up to the trip, Khrushchev personally paid very close attention to every little aspect of the proposed itinerary, including such details as how many guns should salute him during the welcoming ceremony. And Khrushchev's attention to detail and persistence paid off.
At the airport, everything was shining, shimmering, and glittering. I must say that it was done with refined taste, pomp, and great attention to detail. In short, everything that was supposed to be there for an official welcoming ceremony for a head of state was there. I was satisfied.
The President has been given a great deal of advice on what he should do with his visitor. One piece of advice coming from Senator Johnston is that he should take him to church on grounds that it is never too late for a sinner to repent.
As Khrushchev, smiling and waving his hand, rode into Washington, he saw the Americans for the first time. It was an enormous crowd, 250,000 to be exact, lined up all the way along the Soviet Premier's 15-mile ride from the airport. But in contrast to the Soviet Premier, they didn't cheer. They didn't wave their hands. More than that, they didn't even scream insults. They just stood there, completely still and completely silent, eyeing the man passing them in a Lincoln convertible, thinking that this is the same man who would one day push a little red button and unleash upon them a nuclear Armageddon.
Let me ask you, who do you folks represent?
We are from the Committee for National Mourning here in Washington, and we're out on the streets to express national mourning for our country in connection with the visit of Khrushchev to this country. We think it's a tragic event, and we're out to show it.
After arriving at the White House, the first thing that Khrushchev did was to present President Eisenhower with a gift. It was a miniature replica of the iron ball that the Soviets had shot to the moon just one day before Khrushchev arrived in Washington. Needless to say, this impressive Soviet accomplishment was a huge blow for the Americans. After all, just the day before, they had lost the space race once again when the Soviets marked the moon with a pennant that had the short but matter-of-fact inscription, USSR, September 1959. Now, holding up for the cameras the replica of that famous Soviet pennant, Eisenhower was astounded and appalled. How could the barely concealed gloating Khrushchev dare to pull such a publicity stunt during his very first hours in America? But, although boiling inside, Eisenhower behaved like a true politician. He smiled and even thanked Khrushchev for the thoughtful gift. Overall, the score on day one was definitely 1-0 in favor of Khrushchev, at least in the eyes of the American media, who had analyzed the first day of K in the USA in sports-like commentary the next morning.
Today, it's Wednesday, September the 16th, 1959. Right on the hour, and from Studio 3B, here is Dave Garroway.
We'll be covering the Khrushchev visit, of course, this morning, as we did yesterday, and will all this week. We'll be showing you perhaps facets of him that you may not have recognized, like what a great showman he turned out to be yesterday.
Yes, I knew when that little girl presented him with the flowers that he was going to embrace her or pat her head or something.
Little things like taking the play away from the president by holding his Homburg up a couple feet in the air to shade his face.
Things that actors kill other actors for.
Yes,
And
so
the way he took out those little 18th century glasses of his, little round glasses, slowly put them on his face, that was brilliant.
putting his arm around the president in the car riding in from the airport, winking at the reporters.
Tight squeeze, that was, wasn't it?
Yes, there was not very much space left there in that back seat between Mr. and Mrs. K and the president.
They talk about Americans being overfed. I think the Russians do all right.
The president was almost lost in the back seat there. You could barely see him.
At the National Press Club in Washington, an enormous crowd of 500 journalists gathered for history's first ever unscripted Q&A session of the Western press with a leader of the Soviet Union. The very first question addressed Khrushchev's role during his predecessor Stalin's bloody reign.
There is a story that at the meeting of the Communist Party Congress, during which he delivered his long speech, about the crimes that Mr. Stalin had committed, that someone in the audience set up an unsigned but written question. Mr. Khrushchev paused in the middle of the speech and read the question to the audience. What were you doing while Stalin was committing these crimes? The question asked. Mr. Khrushchev suggested that perhaps the author would like to arise and identify himself. No one stood up. Well, comrades, Mr. Khrushchev said, now you know what I was doing while Stalin was committing these crimes. Perhaps the chairman would like to comment on that story.
What I would like to ask the authors of this fable is the following. When you were making this story up, what were you trying to achieve? Did you want to put me in an embarrassing situation, and that's why you started to laugh even before I had a chance to answer it? We, Russians, have a saying, he who laughs last, laughs best. So I would like to warn the tale-tellers of such absurd fables. Be careful, so you wouldn't come to regret your make-believe stories afterwards. But I'm not going to be provoked by you. I'm not going to retaliate with some offensive words. I'm not even going to answer this provocative question, simply because in the end, truth will always prevail over a lie.
This was definitely a pretty scary start for a friendly press conference. But that didn't stop the American journalists from pushing Khrushchev's buttons with more unpleasant questions. Questions about his predecessor, the bloody dictator Stalin, about the Soviet invasion in Hungary, about Khrushchev's infamous "we will bury you" remark, about freedom of speech in the Soviet Union, Jews in the Soviet Union, religion in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev answered some of the questions, laughed off a few others, and dodged the rest. In other words, he proved that whatever else he might be, he was also a cunning politician. At exactly 7:52 the next morning, Khrushchev arrived at Washington Union Station, fully ready for the beginning of his road trip across America.
And there goes our chairman, Nikita Khrushchev, through the honor guard of American Army troops to the train which will take him to New York City. Again, he's waving to the crowds, and he's done this all through his tour of Washington, apparently completely oblivious or uncaring about the fact that very few people in the crowds here have waved back or done anything but stare at him rather stonily. This does not prevent the chairman from waving heartily and smiling, a rather broad, engaging grin, I must confess. So far, in his public appearances, Khrushchev has shown no indication at all that he's even aware of the elaborate, fantastic security precautions that have been taken for his sake.
Khrushchev's security was fantastic indeed. More men were protecting the Soviet premier than any other visiting dignitary in American history. And there were several very solid reasons behind this. First of all, the FBI estimated that at least 25,000 Americans wanted to kill Khrushchev during his journey across the country. Secondly, Soviet security officials, the ominous KGB, had candidly informed their American counterparts that even an unsuccessful attempt at assassination of the chairman would result in a nuclear strike against the United States. On his way to New York, Khrushchev engaged in a heated discussion with his official tour guide, Henry Cabot Lodge. The topic of conversation, initiated by Khrushchev, was fascinating to say the least. Who would win a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States? Lodge was shocked, but Khrushchev's reason for discussing this matter on American soil was actually pretty simple. One of the points on his agenda was to engrave in the minds of everybody he was meeting during the trip that the Soviet Union was a superpower not to be trifled with. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, a likely ground zero in case of a Soviet nuclear attack, hundreds of thousands took to the streets to welcome Mr. K. Well, actually, nobody came to welcome him. Some came to take a peek at him, others to protest, and there were nearly unlimited options on what exactly to protest about. It's easy to find topics to be opposed to when it comes to the world's top communist. But both parties were about to get disappointed. For security reasons, Kay's motorcade zoomed by from the station to the hotel in exactly 6 minutes. So in the end, nobody got a chance to either stare at him gloomily or scream insults at him. And muttering about wasting a good part of the day for nothing, the crowd started to disperse. And by doing so, paralyzed Manhattan for a few more hours. Meanwhile, Kay was already at his first formal event in the Big Apple, the Mayor's Luncheon. Just another routine luncheon, right down to the routine Geiger counter sweep of Khrushchev's chair, table, and food.
In our country, the Soviet Union, the government pays for such banquets. But in the US, it's the people themselves who pay money to attend such events. Imagine, they buy tickets like it's a play in a theater or something. If I may say, this reminded me of something from my youth. When I was a teenager, each year on September 14th, a fair came into the town nearby. It brought in people of all ages, mostly because of the circus and traveling zoo, where for half a ruble you could see a real live elephant. Everybody I knew went to see this elephant, year after year. It was like the thing to do. Well, now, in the US, it was pretty much the same thing. Only instead of an elephant, people came to see me, a Russian bear. They were probably wondering, what does he look like in real life? Does he know how to behave in polite society? What about his table manners? Does he at least know how to hold a knife and a fork properly?
At the table, Khrushchev behaved well. The American elite, during their rendezvous with the Soviet leader, behaved well too. The same couldn't be said about the general American public, though. Next day, near the UN building, there was another protest about Khrushchev's presence in the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Red murder! Red murder! Red murder! Red murder! Red murder!
He called me a Russian, red. Of course, I got on a red dress, but that don't make me a Russian.
What were you...
And I slapped him.
Were you doing any yelling? Were you talking at the time?
I was waving at the thing that was coming over there, and then he said I was a communist because I was waving. I'm free to wave my hand up if I want to. I'm in a free country.
You don't feel like those people that come here?
They're troublemakers.
Why did you come here to see this day? Just general
I
interest?
was here every day since he'd been here on 34th Street and Commodore, and everywhere that the procession be, I was there.
Just curious or what?
Just curious, and then too, if this man here is for any good, freedom, let him come. If it do this country any good for him to be here, I'm glad he's here.
Where are you from?
Alabama. Birmingham.
And did you come up here to New York just to see Mr. Khrushchev, or...
When I'm here, I've been here 8 years. Wait a minute.
What's that?
Wait a minute.
Next day, Khrushchev was to head west, and nobody could have foreseen how things would turn out there.
His two-day visit to New York over, Chairman Khrushchev flies 3,000 miles across the United States to Los Angeles.
Long before Khrushchev's arrival at the Dream Factory, the who's who list of Hollywood was already at the Café de Paris, impatiently awaiting the communist dictator. Even Marilyn Monroe, notorious for being late for anything and everything, arrived several hours in advance. After a brief lunch, the president of 20th Century Fox, Spiros Skouras, took the stand. His speech had a pretty unusual beginning.
I don't know whether you heard that, but the Soviets came there and said, let's hurry up about it.
Espasiba. Mr. Chairman, this I was not going to tell in my speech. But your country is the greatest corporation, the greatest capitalistic firm, the greatest monopoly the world has ever known.
This unexpected slander on the workers' paradise should have made Khrushchev blow a fuse.
A very good monopoly. Хорошо, хорошо.
But once again, an old proverb, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, proved to be true. And Khrushchev simply laughed it off. Soon, things got back to normal, however.
Mr. Chairman, in all modesty, I beg you to look at me. My two brothers and I came from one of the smallest villages of Greece and from a very poor family. In 1910, on coming here, we work as humble boss boys. Because of the American system of equal opportunity. Now, I'm fortunate to be president of 20th Century Fox.
Not an easy task lay before Khrushchev. Now, as a true politician, he had to top this touching and heartwarming rags-to-riches story. And as a true politician, Kay took the bull by the horns right away.
This certainly makes a very good impression, and I wish to express my great respect for you. But at the same time, that doesn't impress me much. Do you want to know who I am? I began working as soon as I learned how to walk. Even before I turned 15, I already had a long list of jobs. First, I shepherded calves, sheep, and cows for capitalists. Then I worked at factories, coal pits, and chemical plants. And who am I now? Now I'm the Prime Minister of the great Soviet Union.
In this friendly clash of the career growth opportunities of the two different systems, Kay had clearly won. And after the victory, he decided to take his speech in a direction which nobody could have foreseen.
America is a fine country. American people are great people. And I'm here as the guest of your president, so I'm the guest of your great country. And I'm very pleased, as well as my comrades, with our stay in America so far. But before I came to your city, an itinerary was drawn up for me with a program of what I'd see here. But just now, right before my speech, I was told, no, you can't go and see such and such town. What's the name of that place?
Disneyland.
Yeah, that's it. So I asked, why not? And they tell me, you see, you can't go there, just you listen. Just you listen to this, just listen to what I've been told. You can't go there because we, the American authorities, cannot guarantee your safety there. Now let me ask you, what is happening there? Is there a cholera or plague outbreak? And if I go there, I will get sick? Or maybe bandits seize Disneyland and they will kill me if I appear there? I really wanted to see that place, but now I can't. And this is the situation in which I, your guest, find myself in. This is beyond my understanding. I thought you had a well-organized household here, and when I would come, my security wouldn't be due to the fact that I would be locked in a bulletproof closed car, stewing and sweltering under your sun for hours upon hours until all the juices leave my body and I become completely dried up. I thought that I would be able to walk freely among the free American people, but now they tell me, no, it's impossible. This causes bitter regret, and I cannot but express my disappointment and dismay to you. Thank you for your attention.
As Hollywood gave the Soviet premier a standing ovation, everyone was pretty much in shock. And it's easy to understand why. After all, they just witnessed a temper tantrum thrown by a 65-year-old communist dictator because his visit to Disneyland got cancelled.
From an entertainer's point of view, what did you think of the show today?
It was a very interesting afternoon.
What did you find most interesting?
Nearly everything.
What did you think of the ad-libs?
Interesting. Very interesting.
Is this what you expected here today? What did you come expecting?
Roast beef.
I expected it to be interesting.
From one Hollywood spectacular to another, Soundstage 8, where the Cole Porter film musical Can-Can is in production.
During my visit to Hollywood, I was invited to watch the filming of a scene from the movie called Can-Can. During the dance, the girls swept up their skirts and exposed their behinds. Well, not all the way. I mean, they kept their drawers on, but still. In general, I would say it was a very spicy film. We Soviets weren't used to this genre. It was a film for adults only.
By this time, pretty much everyone in the audience was once again astounded, thinking, why was this chosen to showcase contemporary Hollywood to Khrushchev? But when the Can-Can ended, Kay didn't seem appalled or offended. He smiled and gladly chatted with the actresses.
Then the photographer started snapping pictures of me surrounded by these girls. I heard one of them telling the girl, who was standing right next to me, lift your skirt up, higher, higher, higher. Apparently, he wanted to get a naughty picture of me. It was definitely an anti-Soviet move on his part. I think he wanted to degrade me by getting such a photograph. I imagine him thinking, so Khrushchev came to Hollywood and got his pictures taken with girls who behaved like that.
After Hollywood, with Disneyland off limits, the American hosts killed time by driving rather aimlessly around LA and its suburbs. And once again, Khrushchev found himself stewing under the hot California sun in a closed, bulletproof Cadillac with no air conditioning. But this time, it was not just incredibly hot, it was also incredibly boring. Luckily, everything comes to an end. And finally, after almost 3 hours of pointless driving, Khrushchev arrived at the Ambassador Hotel for the LA mayor's official dinner.
Everything was going fine at that dinner until this mayor of LA gave his speech. I don't remember this mayor's name, but he wasn't fat and he didn't have a big snout. In other words, he didn't look the way our artists usually depict capitalists in our propaganda posters.
Mr. Chairman, we do not agree with your widely quoted phrase, "We shall bury you." You shall not bury us. We're happy with our way of life. We recognize its shortcomings and are always trying to improve it. But if challenged, we shall fight to the death to preserve it.
This "we will bury you" had been haunting Khrushchev for nearly 3 years. Back in 1956, while addressing foreign ambassadors in Moscow, Kay had said, "Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will dig you in." What he meant by that is that socialism would eventually triumph over capitalism in economic and political competition. But the American propaganda machine took this quote out of context, translated it the way it saw fit, and used it as a communist scare tactic. Khrushchev wants to kill you. In the 3 years that followed, Khrushchev explained more than once what he meant by this phrase, and he wasn't about to do it one more time.
I was about to explode. Of course, I could have let it pass, but sometimes these anti-Soviet types need a good punch in the teeth. And so, after the end of my prepared speech, I went for a counterattack. And now I turn to you, my dear mayor, my host. You treated me and my comrades to an excellent meal, and I thank you for it. But I will speak my mind nevertheless. Can I do so in your country? You said in your speech that we want to bury you. I want to ask you, why did you bring this up? Following my arrival in America, I already had a chance to give an in-depth explanation on this matter during my press conference. After all, I suppose mayors in your country read the press. Because in our country, chairmen of city committees read newspapers on a daily basis. If they don't, they have a good chance of not being elected for the next term. But on a more serious note, I came here with serious intentions. But you are trying to reduce my visit to a joke. You should first understand what exactly we are talking about here. I hope you do realize that we are talking about matters of peace or war, and life or death here.
Then Khrushchev seemed to calm down a bit, but nevertheless ended his speech with an ominous statement in which he basically said, "You know what? I don't feel welcome here. It took me about 12 hours to fly to your country. It should take me just 10 hours or so to fly back. But remember, I am the first ever head of Russia to visit the United States. I can go, no problem. But I don't know when, if ever, another Soviet premier will visit your country." Shocked dinner guests struggled to understand what this implied exactly. The end of Khrushchev's visit to the United States? Or the beginning of World War III? But Khrushchev didn't stop there. Later that night, he threw yet another dramatic temper tantrum. This one behind the closed doors of his hotel room. There, he screamed, lambasting the reception he had been receiving to smithereens, once again threatening to leave the United States immediately if things didn't change. The actual list of Khrushchev's complaints was pretty long. He cursed the endless boring official breakfasts, luncheons and dinners, not being able to meet real Americans, the cancellation of his Disneyland visit, and of course, the LA mayor. He seemed so angry that even his aides, used to Khrushchev's explosive character, got really frightened. But at the end of his tantrum, Khrushchev smiled, put his finger to his lips, and pointed to the ceiling, where he figured the FBI had installed listening devices. Like his other tantrums that day, this one was an act. He was simply bluffing, trying to scare the Americans into treating him better. And it worked like a charm.
Well, we'll switch now to Washington for more on the capital's feelings about this aspect of the tour from CBS News correspondent Howard K. Smith.
Washington, where or near where the climax of Khrushchev's trip will be played in a few days, has watched the Soviet leader's tour past the halfway mark with mixed feelings. There is, as the White House statement said today, a profound wish that Khrushchev will be treated courteously on his tour. It would be a shame if relations between the giant nuclear nations which survived the Berlin blockade and the Korean War should now founder on a missed excursion to the Disneyland amusement park. Washington wants nothing to happen which would cast a shadow on the talks Khrushchev is to have with President Eisenhower here late this week.
The White House decision to keep Khrushchev happy at all costs went into effect the very next morning. Khrushchev's train on its way from Los Angeles to San Francisco was allowed to make whistle stops, so the chairman could finally meet and greet ordinary citizens of America face to face.
I am impressed by the number of people waiting to see the Soviet premier. Maybe we can talk to some of these people and find out just exactly why they came out to see Mr. Khrushchev. Tell me, how did you happen to come down to the station today to see the Soviet premier?
Well, we thought we'd like to have a look at him and put so much about him.
Is there anything you'd like to say to him?
Not particularly.
Just curiosity.
Right.
Have you ever been down to the station before to see any other personality pass
No,
through?
I'm afraid I haven't.
How about you, sir? What's your interest in coming down to the station today to see this train?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't speak English very well, sir.
Well, you speak very well.
I just came here for curiosity, that's all.
Curiosity. Well, that's as good an answer as I've had all day.
For the first time since the beginning of the trip, Kay was working the crowd, and he was loving it. But what was even more amazing is that the Americans, who got a chance to hang out with Mr. Kay for the first time, loved it too. Sure, for them, he was still a communist dictator, but also by now, thanks to the extensive media coverage, he had become a larger-than-life celebrity. The laughing, joking, grumbling, and unpredictable star of the first-ever non-stop media show. To Americans, Mr. Kay was starting to seem like a familiar sitcom character, the grumpy, growling uncle with a secret heart of gold. After all, the average American could easily understand how a guy might get upset if some government bureaucrat stopped him from seeing Disneyland. Back on the train, Khrushchev suddenly asked Lodge, "Say, do you remember this LA mayor of yours?" Yes, I do," carefully answered Lodge, not knowing what to expect and secretly fearing another tantrum. "I think your mayor tried to let out a fart. But instead, he shat his own pants," laughed Khrushchev joyfully. And just like that, all the unpleasantness of LA was forgotten. And for the rest of the day, the chairman was in an excellent mood. Next morning in San Francisco, celebrity gawkers started gathering outside the Mark Hopkins Hotel as early as 5 a.m. There were people from all walks of life, but they had one thing in common. All of them were Khrushchev-struck. Throughout the day, the hype around Mr. Kay in San Francisco continued to rise, and by the late afternoon, it came close to boiling point. By the time Khrushchev and his entourage entered Quality Foods, a huge new suburban supermarket, it was already packed with the media mob, celebrity gawkers, and completely stunned regular shoppers. As soon as the tour started, the crowd surged toward the celebrity dictator, trying not to miss a single moment of this historic event, a communist leader in a capitalist supermarket. Cameramen and photographers were going bananas, elbowing each other and climbing onto shelves and counters to get a good shot of Mr. Kay. Housewives held their babies up high for them to catch a glimpse of the Red King. Teenage girls had the time of their lives. One of them shook Kay's hand, screeched, "He touched me," and fainted. As Khrushchev went through the store, mass hysteria followed him. As one of the reporters present duly noted, it was like a happy hour in a manic-depressive ward. Pretty soon, police found it impossible to handle the crowd, cut the tour short, and whisked Khrushchev away. All in all, it was a logical grand finale to Khrushchev's first week in America.
From San Francisco, Mr. Khrushchev flies to Des Moines, Iowa, a city in the center of the United States.
What do you folks think about Nikita Khrushchev's coming to Des Moines? Are you in favor of it?
Well, I think it's a wonderful thing for him to see ordinary people live and how we live in America.
If you did see him, would you wave?
Oh, yeah, I'd wave at him. I'd wave anyway if I didn't like him, you know. I mean, it'd be a poor wave, you know.
A poor wave?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And that's the way the people feel along the drug counter of Katz Drug Store.
Now, to see how things have been progressing from that point, let's pick up the Khrushchev party with our live television cameras to get this exclusive view.
The temperature was some 36 degrees in this cooling room. Mr. Menshikov, the Soviet ambassador to the United States, tried to hurry
This is the room
the
where
premier
we
along.
cattle into.
I got to be here. I must.
After the tour of the packing plant, we came into this room, where the tasting was supposed to take place. And we saw that all the film, TV and radio broadcasting equipment was already there. The place was also literally packed with journalists. This capitalist, the owner of the factory, I mean, definitely knew what marketing is all about. He'd apparently decided to use my visit as free advertising for his products, because after this he'd be able to say, Khrushchev visited our plant, he tasted our products, he really enjoyed our sausages. This means that our sausages are the best. So this is how I ended up stuffing myself with these American sausages on live TV.
This was definitely another unexpected turn of events. The man who had arrived in America as the world's most notorious communist was about to become a familiar character of American capitalism, the celebrity pitchman.
Now, tell him that he's going to have the pleasure of eating one of our hot dogs with pretty girls to serve him. A little mustard. Would he like mustard?
Горчицу? Хотите, да? Yes, of course. Yes,
of course. Okay.
Вы когда-нибудь ели уже американские сосиски или первый раз? I think it's my first.
Wait a minute. We want to get your face. Let's open this television.
Open the way to the camera.
All right, let's
Back up, please. Back up. Back up.
Okay.
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 Mr. Khrushchev had his first Frankfurter
Take a big bite. Show him take
in the sausage-making department of the packing plant. He proclaimed it good, except he said the trouble was there wasn't any beer to go with it. He also said that the sausage was so excellent they should not change the formula. It hadn't been suggested that they were thinking of changing the formula.
Nikita Khrushchev is at the heart of the matter tonight in Des Moines, Iowa, where he's the biggest attraction since the Iowa State Fair closed about 2 weeks ago. Well, tomorrow, Mr. Khrushchev goes to the Garst farm, the real object of his visit to Iowa. He had said all along that he hoped to visit his old friend Roswell Garst at Coon Rapids. Our live television cameras will be on the scene, and tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, we'll return with a complete report on Khrushchev on the farm.
The eccentric corn farmer, millionaire Roswell Garst, whom the Soviet premier lovingly called my best American friend, was a very interesting character. The two had hit it off 4 years earlier, when Garst was invited to the Soviet Union as an agricultural expert on corn. But unexpectedly, at the end of his visit, found himself in a tete-a-tete meeting with Mr. K. At the end of this improbable meeting, Garst sold Kay 5,000 tons of his hybrid seed corn. And just like that, thanks to a friendship with the world's top communist, the American capitalist farmer's wealth grew from $300,000 to $7 million in a matter of just a few years. But on Wednesday, September the 23rd, 1959, even the clever Mr. Garst didn't know what he was in for. Long before Khrushchev's arrival, the Garst farm already resembled a madhouse. A 300-strong media mob of exhausted but at the same time overexcited journalists was running wild all over the place, just like a bunch of little kids. who'd missed their midday nap.
There was like a whole army of media at the Garst farm that day. When Garst started showing me around, this horde of journalists, photographers and cameramen literally started running around us in circles. Pretty soon, Garst started to get furious. And he had a perfectly good reason for it. These journalists were trampling his crops. They were worse than locusts. By the time when one American journalist appeared right in front of us, he probably just wanted to take a good picture or something. Garst was already boiling with rage. And so he went and kicked that journalist in the ass. And I must say, left a pretty good footprint on the journalist's backside.
Never before in American history had one man been the subject of such extensive media coverage. It can be safely said that this trip marked the debut of the now all too familiar phenomenon of the non-stop, round-the-clock media circus. A hot story, reported, recorded, and inevitably distorted. By day 10 of the trip, it was absolutely clear that something had changed in America. Less than 2 weeks ago, when Khrushchev rode into Washington, the crowd stood silent, sullen, and afraid. Now, they smiled, cheered, and rejoiced. Of course, in these 10 days, Khrushchev had not converted Americans to communism, but he had succeeded in charming them. And it can be said that to some extent, he even freed them from the fear. After all, he seemed like a down-to-earth fellow who laughed and joked and sometimes lost his temper. In other words, he was just like one of them. Surely a guy like that won't start a nuclear Armageddon. Yes, he was still the world's top communist, but nobody's perfect, right? And so, in spite of all his flaws, Americans just kind of liked the old guy. And Khrushchev seemed to like them too. While visiting a steel mill in Pittsburgh, one of the workers presented him with a cigar. Khrushchev didn't smoke, but he was clearly touched by this gesture. He put the cigar in his pocket, thanked the worker, and then, unexpectedly, took off his wristwatch and handed it to him. Nikita Khrushchev's watch turned Kenneth Jackie into an instant celebrity. Next day, he even took Khrushchev's watch to a jeweler to find out how much insurance he should get. But the jeweler told him not to bother. It turned out that the ruler of the largest nation of the world wore a $14 watch.
From Pittsburgh, Mr. Khrushchev flies back to Washington. He returns to the capital city from which his American journey began. Behind him are busy days of traveling and constantly meeting people. Ahead are a few days of private conversations with President Eisenhower.
Khrushchev's return to Washington marked the end of his fun road trip across America. Next on the schedule was work. The two most powerful people in the world, Chairman Khrushchev and President Eisenhower, were to sit down at Camp David and negotiate solutions to the many burning issues of the Cold War. By now, it was clear that the White House agenda had fallen through. Khrushchev hadn't been softened up for the talks as originally planned. In fact, he was going in stronger than ever. Three days later, when Khrushchev and Eisenhower rode back together from Camp David to Washington, it was already clear that the talks hadn't gone that well. In fact, the two leaders hadn't come to a solid agreement on any of the issues discussed, which included the Cold War hotspot Berlin, disarmament and trade relations, among many others. But why? What happened at Camp David?
During our talks at Camp David, Eisenhower would repeatedly tell me, "Mr. Khrushchev, I really want to come to an agreement with you on these burning issues." I would answer him, "Mr. President, it would make me very happy as well." But at the same time I knew, how could we come to an agreement? The positions of our two countries at the time stood in such extreme opposition to each other. The conditions simply weren't ripe yet for us to come to an agreement on pretty much anything. And to be perfectly frank, I never had any illusions that I would come to America, would have a talk, and all of the world's problems would magically disappear. What kind of a daydream is that? Moscow wasn't built in a day, you know? These things take time, and you have to start small. We came to the USA to see and to be seen, and that's exactly what we did.
But at the same time, the talks were not a total waste. The two elderly gentlemen ate together, watched movies together, and took long walks together. And in the process, they came to know each other a little, and even to like each other a little. After the end of the talks, Khrushchev invited Eisenhower to come to Russia the following spring, and the American president accepted the invitation. The 7 months following Khrushchev's return from the United States were some of the warmest of the Cold War. The Russians received a positive image of the Americans from their leaders' speeches and the unexpectedly positive Soviet media coverage of the trip, and it changed their perception of America. For their part, the Americans transferred the image of a jolly, down-to-earth Khrushchev onto the way they felt about the Soviet Union. The propaganda machines on both sides all of a sudden started talking about a new era of good feelings between the two superpowers. And in the minds of many people, not just in the Soviet Union and the United States, but all around the world, Cold War was coming to an end. But everything changed on May the 1st, 1960, when a U-2 was shot down over the territory of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev took the news of an American spy plane over Russia hard. He felt betrayed by Eisenhower. Betrayed on a personal, human level. Over the past few months, he had started referring to President Eisenhower as his American friend, and now his friend had stuck a knife in his back. And Khrushchev was quick to retaliate. Contrary to all diplomatic norms, in an angry public speech, he cancelled Eisenhower's upcoming visit to Russia.
And after this, oh my dear God, Eisenhower wants to come here? I don't understand this. I just don't. Is he clueless or what? It's pretty straightforward from my point of view. You don't eat where you shit. It's that simple. It's not that hard to understand, you know? The president took a dump in the Soviet Union, and now he wants to come to me, to Khrushchev, for a dinner? But how can I be a host to him after what he did to me?
But even after this, Khrushchev wasn't done. 2 weeks later, on May the 16th, he arrived in France for a long-planned four-power Paris summit. Here, he once again demanded an official apology from President Eisenhower. For political reasons, Eisenhower couldn't give him one. In retort, Khrushchev, with great relish, sabotaged the summit and left the talks before they even started. As the next step of his vendetta, Khrushchev, against standard protocol, appointed himself as the head of the Soviet delegation to the United Nations, and in September returned to New York to denounce Eisenhower on Eisenhower's own turf. At the UN, Khrushchev met Fidel Castro for the first time, and one day, protesting a speech, took off his shoe and briefly banged the desk with it. Paradoxically, this 30-second-long shoe-banging incident would become the most famous act of his life in the Western collective memory. In 1962, Khrushchev sent Soviet nuclear missiles to communist Cuba. When the Americans found out about this, President Kennedy ordered US ships to blockade the island and demanded of Khrushchev to remove the nukes. For 13 days, the world hung on the brink of a nuclear war. And at the very last minute, Khrushchev backed down. But why? Yes, of course, Khrushchev had many reasons to do so. After all, he was a wise and masterful politician. But what if love had something to do with it as well? So let's imagine just theoretically, mind you, that among the many reasons why Khrushchev didn't push that little red button during the Cuban Missile Crisis were the fond memories of his fleeting but true love affair with America. After all, the butterfly effect, minor events resulting in grand consequences, is a serious scientific theory. So maybe this trip was more important than we realized. Or maybe not. Who knows what mysteries lurk in the human heart? And who knows what mysteries lurked in the heart of the pudgy Russian with the big smile who roamed across the United States so many long years ago?